Bore da. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the opening session of our Green Ambition series, which is taking place this week. Bore da I chi, a chroeso cynnes iawn i'n sesiwn agoriadol o'r cyfres gweledigaeth werdd sy'n cael ei chynnal wrthnos hon. Apologies for the late start, we had slight technical issues. But running from today until Thursday, this series will help you to realise your green ambitions by covering a wide variety of subjects. All of the events this week will be followed by Q&A sessions, so you have the opportunity to question the speakers, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Just before we get going, however, TV presenter, naturalist and author Iolo Williams is going to officially welcome you to this morning's session. The welcome is in Welsh with English subtitles, but then the rest of today's events and for the rest of the week, all of them will be held in English. Mae croeso i chi gysylltu ni yn y Gymraeg, wrth gwrs, os hoffech chi, gan ddefnyddio y cyfleuster cwestiwn ac ateb. You're welcome to correspond with us in Welsh if you prefer by using the Q&A facility.
Helo yna, a croeso i gyfres y weledigaeth werdd busnes Cymru. Iolo Williams ydw I, a dwi'n falch o gyflwyno'r gyfres ddiddorol hon o ddigwyddiadau a greuwyd I gynorthwyo busnesau I ddod yn fwy effeithlon o ran adnoddau. Os ydych chi, fel finnau, a diddordeb brwd mewn cynaladwyedd ac effaith amgylcheddol, yna bydd y gyfres hon yn darparu arweiniad a chymorth i'ch helpu I wneud newidiadau yn eich busnes. Mae tîm arbenigol Busnes Cymru wrth law I gynnig sesiynau cyngor un I un unigryw. Felly, os ydych chi wedi eich ysbrydoli gan yr hyn a glywch chi heddiw, yna cysylltwch â'r tîm I archebu eich sesiwn rhad ac am ddim, lle bydd cynghorwyr yn eich helpu I fapio'ch gweledigaeth werdd a symud ymlaen tuag at ddod yn fusnes fwy effeithlon o ran adnoddau. Pob lwc a diolch yn fawr I chi.
Diolch yn fawr Iolo. Thank you very much, Iolo. And thank you also to Business Wales for organising this event. So Business Wales is a free service that provides impartial, independent support and advice to people starting, running and growing a business. I myself, as well as doing this kind of work, I have a company and have used Business Wales on many occasions. It's a fabulous facility. It's funded by the Welsh Government and European Regional Development Fund, and has an excellent track record in providing innovative events, just like this series this week, and training sessions. So let's get going. Amser felly I ddechrau. And we start this morning looking at measuring your carbon impact and working towards net zero in business. Rydyn ni'n dechrau gan edrych ar sut I fesur eich effaith carbon a gweithio tuag at net zero mewn busnes. The session is being delivered this morning by carbon accounting experts Planet Mark, and will introduce you to all the good reasons for becoming resource efficient and measuring and reducing carbon emissions, such as cost reductions, reputational gain, attracting new audiences, an increasingly aware customer base, as well as improved staff retention and future-proofing your business. So over to you, Planet Mark.
Hello, hello. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am just going to settle in here, get comfortable, make sure you guys can see my screen here. Is that looking good? Okay, wonderful. Thank you again. Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah. I'm an engagement manager with Planet Mark, and it's such a pleasure having you all on this call today. I know we have about 2 hours sort of scheduled for this. We might not need the whole time. It depends on how many questions you have along the way. Please keep them coming. You know, there's a Q&A box to do that and chat function as well. But essentially, my job today is going to be provide you with an introduction to net zero and what it means to the business community in Wales and generally. So perhaps we are aware reaching net zero by 2050 is a Welsh government and UK target, and it's important that you are equipped, not only with the knowledge and tools, but also with the confidence to pursue this for your businesses, right? So that's what this training is designed to do, right? To introduce you to the tools and techniques that you can use to measure your impact and create plans to work more sustainably. So thank you again for being a part of this. To help us get just sort of a clear overview of what we'll be covering in this session today, I've also set out a few key objectives just so we all know what we're getting ourselves into here, right? So this is just to sort of set out the expectations, right? We have 5 main things that we're hoping to do. First and foremost, we're going to provide an overview of what net zero is, right? The drivers for net zero and what the business imperatives are for acting on net zero. Then we're going to dive into, the importance of target setting and carbon footprinting as a tool for you to sort of measure your progress to net zero. Then we'll move along to exploring and discussing sort of practical steps that you can take as you start your journey towards net zero, supported by our action plan framework, which I will share with you in due course. Then we're going to dive into the importance of a positive narrative and approach to effectively engaging and communicating with your stakeholders, right? Last but not least, we'll also direct you to relevant tools and freely available resources that are out there as well. So I know it might sound like a lot, but don't worry, this is just designed to be a comprehensive introduction. There's no pressure on you to kind of leave here being an expert. That's what the Business Whales team are here to support you on, right? They're going to be the ones who will help take a little bit of pressure off moving forward. You'll be able to go to them for guidance and things like that. So we can breathe easy, right? Now, just before we sort of dive in, I figured it would be worth kind of just clarifying a little bit about Planet Mark, right? Why we were invited here to talk with you today. So let me tell you a little bit about us, right? So Planet Mark is a sustainability certification. We help organizations measure their environmental and social impacts and support them to take active steps towards mitigating the bad effects while also simultaneously encouraging them to do more good, right? So our certification recognizes continuous improvement, it encourages action, and it builds an empowered community of like-minded individuals who really make the world of difference. Now, we use a sort of very simple three-step process to accomplish all of this, which is here on the slide: measure, engage, and communicate. So measure, to put it simply, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? So we help organizations collate carbon and social value data to measure their impacts. Then we have engage as an engagement manager. This part's very close to my heart. And this is about unlocking internal passions and building an organic culture of sustainability from within organizations, right? Then last but not least is communicate. And this is about supporting organizations to share their achievements authentically and effectively with the world. So needless to say, we are very, very passionate about the power that businesses and organizations have to affect positive change and mitigate the effects of climate change. In addition to, our day jobs, in the lead up to the recent COP26 summit this past fall, we also took this message on the road as part of our zero carbon tour here, right? This was an incredible experience. I was so excited to participate in this myself. This is our big blue battle bus, as we refer to it. It's 100% electric, and in collaboration with the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy, along with Google, the Institute of Directors, and in support of the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign and Together for Our Planet, we held events across 125 locations, really across the country, right? Including a few stop-offs in Wales. We were in Swansea, Cardiff, Wrexham, just to name a few. And we had over 8,000 people attending our tour events, sitting down to learn about net zero and to share their firsthand experiences on this journey. And yeah, it was really powerful stuff. So we're just so pleased to be able to use all of that fabulous learning and insight in our session today. Oh, I always forget I have one more click and then I show you a map. Woo, these are all the locations we went to. It was really good fun. Okay, so seeing as the sort of main focus for the day is around net zero, I wanted to actually just cut straight to the chase. Let's put the definition of net zero on the table, right? Let's just start there. So net zero, I know it's a complex thing, right? And it's evolving all the time. There's no international standard at present, and so it's often misused. But you can rest assured that we at Planet Mark are aligned with thought leadership and industry best practice. This is informed by bodies including the UN Race to Zero, the IPCC, and science-based targets. So, when looking for a definition of net zero, we chose to highlight the one from the IPCC, which stands for, sorry, I'm recognizing I'm using some acronyms there. That stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, they define net zero as the point when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specific period. Now, I know there's a lot of words there, but for me, the key word is about balance, right? It's about bringing our impacts back into alignment. What we're emitting is no more than what is being removed, right? So let's talk a little bit now about why we should care about net zero, right? Let's actually take a step back and just start with the big picture. So we love the astronaut's perspective. We use this vantage point a lot. We think it's really a great reminder not only of Earth's beauty, but of the fact that it's truly our one home. And it also highlights the fact that we're part of this beautiful, interconnected, interdependent web of life that's evolved over billions of years into this, right? This balanced set of natural systems defined by diversity and circularity. However, since the start of the Great Acceleration period, right after the Second World War, we have catapulted humanity and the planet into a new geological period that scientists are calling the Anthropocene. Now, that's a period where it's very human-centered and human-dominated. It's a time where human activity and not the natural processes are dominating and affecting the very systems that we rely on, right? Primarily through deforestation and a drastic consumption of resources, as well as burning fossil fuels. So this means that humans have now become the prime driver of a changing climate on this planet. And this has led to the greenhouse effect, right? So the greenhouse effect relates to the balance between how much of the energy from the sun that enters the Earth atmosphere is then reflected back into space and how much of it stays, right? So we emit greenhouse gases, things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, from activities like traveling or waste generation, manufacturing, energy consumption, agriculture, even service delivery. And because of our dependence on the burning of fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions are an output of pretty much every business to a greater or lesser extent, right? And while about 50% of carbon dioxide that we emit is absorbed by the forests and the oceans, the remaining 50% sort of accumulates in the atmosphere. And this results in a compound global warming effect, right? So essentially, the other way to think about it is that these emissions then act as a bit of a blanket that's wrapped around the Earth, and then the heat is trapped inside, right? This results in, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss. So obviously, this is not good for our planet, and we find ourselves in a position that we've really never been in throughout history, right? And to help emphasize that point, I actually like to refer to this graph. So what we're seeing here, what this is showing us, is the fluctuating levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide over the past 400,000 years, right? And you can see along the left, it kind of goes up and down, but it stays, within a certain sort of parameter. But what we're seeing along the right-hand side here is that great acceleration period that I mentioned, right? Where we started burning immense quantities of fossil fuels. And this has resulted in this sort of exponential curve and this peak beyond anything that we have ever seen in the past. So all of this to say that, yes, we are already seeing the effects of the climate crisis, but instead of, bombarding you with scary images and of, severe weather events to sort of talk about the effects of climate change, we thought we would use these images instead. So the one on the right, on the left, is from the IPCC report from August, but the one on the right, this is one I like to kind of talk through. It's a really cool data visualization graphic. Lola, wake up tongue. And this uses essentially a series of colored stripes to chronologically order and visually portray the long-term temperature trends, right? It was originally published by climatologist Ed Hawkins. And it really helps hit home that, the previous 10 years, what we're seeing all the way on the right-hand side there, have been the hottest years on record. Now, one thing to note, and I'm really conscious of how we are choosing to illuminate the effects of climate change, and I appreciate that I'm talking a lot about temperature, but I don't want to give the impression that climate change is something that only happens to the natural environment, when in fact its impacts are much farther reaching, right? There are people and communities behind all of these locations. Coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, for example. And yeah, I really just like to take a moment in these sessions to emphasize that climate justice is intrinsically linked with social justice, right? Now, in addition to the sort of environmental and social imperatives that I've covered, why else is it important to work towards net zero now, right? Well, the good news is that there are great commercial benefits as well, right? It just makes business sense. So these are things like cost saving, right? I feel like the cost saving side of things, people are maybe slightly more familiar with or understand. Like, I think we understand the idea that if we, turn off our lights, we're not going to be using electricity. We will see that translated into a lower electricity bill. But that's just sort of one side of the commercial coin, right? There are other benefits as well. So things like growing profits, right? Customers now more than ever want to be rewarding businesses that are doing good and that have sustainable practices in place. There's also, the transparency argument, right? It results in greater transparency, which leads to increased customer trust, which is a really big one. Then last but not least, there's also, the ability to attract and retain talent, right? There are some great stats here. I actually, sorry, I didn't put any of them up on the slide, but I know there was a BBC report that found that 79% of millennial employees are loyal to companies that care about their effect on society. Now, to compound this, 60% of the workforce will be millennials by 2025, right? So it's definitely something to take into consideration when you're looking to attract and retain talent, right? And also, of course, it's just great future-proofing. Now, the last little bubble that we have here sort of relates to the regulatory imperative. So in May of 2019, Wales and the whole of the UK put into law a commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, accepting the recommendation of the Climate Change Committee. Brilliant. Now, predating this, however, in 2015, Wales has also passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. This act requires public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impact of their decisions, to work better with people, communities, and each other, and to, prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequality, and climate change, right? So the act is unique to Wales, and it's attracting interest from really countries across the world, as it offers a huge opportunity to make long-lasting positive change to current and future generations. Moving forward, and more recently, I think in October 2021, Wales have published their Working Together to Reach Net Zero All Wales plan, which highlights the incredible commitment and work from their partners striving towards net zero. So all of this represents a significant change to the level of future ambition that the business community will have to engage with, right? And in fact, no sector is exempt. This is actually, I love this graph. So achieving net zero will require vast transformational change. And this graph sort of helps sort of visually describe that. Now, this was taken from Mark Carney's book, Values, and it shows, right? It shows this transformation that all sectors are going to have to go through by 2050. And you can see, for the most part, every sector is reducing their emissions drastically. The only things that are increasing are nature-based sources and nature-based sink, those things that are going to help us absorb carbon. And I will get to those in a little bit more detail, right? Now, I understand that a graph like this might look a little intimidating, but there are some really exciting things that will occur during this transformation as well. And, to pull another nugget from Mark Carney here, he says in this quote, "This is a whole economy adjustment. This isn't just about niche products or renewable solutions. Companies that have a strategy will be rewarded. The transition to net zero is creating the greatest commercial opportunity of our age," right? Now, if that isn't something that will galvanize the business community, I don't know what will. And the truth is, it's working, right? I have another slide here with some great stats. I think the one that's there at the top is 1/5 of the world's corporates have set net zero targets. But another one that I actually like to share, because I think it kind of builds this global picture a little bit better, is that 1,045 companies representing more than 23 trillion in market capital, so more than the GDP of the United States, have responded to the urgent call to decarbonize at pace and scale required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the companies span 53 sectors in 60 countries and have more than 32 million employees, right? So there is a lot of work being done in this space. Now, I think for the time being, that's enough about, the why. I would now like to go into a little bit of the carbon jargon side of things, because I'm conscious that I may even have started using some of these terms without even knowing it, right? So to help us sort of build a foundation, we're going to take a look at just the vocabulary and the concepts that exist in this space, right? To help us build a foundation as we sort of grow into our understanding today. So where I like to start is here with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so often abbreviated to the GHG Protocol. So building on a 20-year partnership between the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol supplies the most comprehensive global greenhouse gas accounting standards, right? It's all about the accounting standards. So this is really the framework for all emissions measurement globally, right? And the reason we start here is because this is the source of some of the most sort of prominently used terminology, most notably the scopes. So you may or may not have heard about them, but understanding these is really, really key when breaking down net zero. So I want to take some time to go through these now, right? So I have both a definition on the left-hand side and a visual representation on the right. And what we're seeing here, scope 1, let's start there. That's what's in the dark gray in the center of this visual here. So so scope 1, these are also referred to as your direct emissions. Now, these are emissions over which you as a business would have direct control. So think about things like the fuel that you burn directly. This is things like your company vehicles, or like boilers for your heating. That's also another really common source. Then we have scope 2, which is indirect, and this is very specific. It relates to the electricity that you buy, right? If the electricity is coming straight off the grid, and therefore, if you're using renewable energy, your scope 2 will be massively reduced. But that's scope 2. Scope 2 is indirect, it's your energy. Now, scope 3 is everything else. There are actually 15 different scope 3 categories, right? So, what we find is that while scopes 1 and 2 are relatively straightforward and easy to bring down, tackling the scope 3 emission, this requires collaboration. It's both upstream and downstream, right, with your employees, your suppliers, contractors, customers, and clients. So these emissions, include how your employees commute to work, or go for business meetings, business travel, as well as the emissions coming from, using your products or services, for instance. So yeah, while they tend to be sort of the trickiest to tackle, because not only are there so many of them, they are, quite complex. There's just a lot of moving parts to scope 3. It's really, really important to put pressure on, organizations like yourselves to address scope 3 emissions, because what we see is that, from businesses that have done a full, carbon footprint calculation, scope 3 ends up resulting in the largest percentage of their total carbon emissions, right? Oftentimes, scope 3 can represent over 90% of a business's impact. So if you're only looking at scopes 1 and 2, sure, that's a good start, but you need to make sure you're getting that full picture by including scope 3 as well. So how does this come together when we look at net zero? So as a reminder, here's a look at our definition, right, that we had earlier, that point when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere are balanced by the anthropogenic removals over a specific period, right? And I had our nice little animation there. But let's look at, I feel like this is, at the moment, just having a definition there, just kind of a concept. So how do we translate this for business, right? So again, I brought along a little diagram to help us here. Now, in line with our ambitious standard, this represents best practice, right? Our definition here of net zero is comprised of 3 key elements that we can talk through now. So yeah, I think let's just start with the bubble on the left-hand side here. So this relates to your scopes 1 and 2, your direct and your purchased emissions, right? Now, those have to come all the way down to 0. It's absolutely possible. This is things like, switching to renewable energy, electrifying your fleet, and also looking at just general energy efficiencies, right? Bringing those all the way down to 0. Now, scope 3, your indirect emissions, the goal is to bring them as close down to 0 as possible. The reason we say as close as possible to 0 is because we do understand that there are some limitations, right? Technology hasn't necessarily caught up with all of our ambitions in this space. So there is a little bit of room here, but it's minimal, right? So this is going to be done through things like supplier engagement, waste reduction, travel hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera. So as scope 3 has to come down as close to zero as possible. Now, where, I think the minimum that is set out by the Science Based Target Initiative is 90% reduction, right? So you can have maybe 10% of your scope 3 emissions that for some reason or another, as I was mentioning, technological advances haven't caught up with us or what have you. Those are what we refer to as your residual emissions, right? The things that can't actually be brought down to absolute zero. So that's what brings us to this third bubble here, your residual emissions. Now, to deal with those, you essentially have to offset them by using accredited carbon removal schemes. Now, I know there's quite a few terms in there that I will break these down for us in a little bit more detail, but the key things here, I'm sure we've all heard of carbon offsets, but the key in this definition is that they have to be accredited and they have to be carbon removal schemes. And I'll go into that in more detail, right? So these are things by using natural solutions, which I'll elaborate on, and limited technologies. So, wow, there we have it. All of those things in combination would be how you would achieve net zero. Now, one thing I find really helpful, I know for those of you that are seeing this for the first time, it can be complicated and it's a little tricky to sort of wrap our head around. So one of the things that I found helpful when I was first approaching this subject is to kind of like compare net zero to other standards. So let's take a look now at how net zero compares to, for example, carbon neutral. Oops, skipped a slide. There we go. So I love this table. This I always find super interesting because I find that, carbon neutral is definitely a term that we may have been familiar with, right? It's been around for a while. It has a very specific standard. And there are lots of businesses who are communicating the fact that they've gone carbon neutral, right? But what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? And knowing this, with this new vocabulary that we have around our scopes, what does this look like? So let me actually I love using this little laser pointer feature here. Yes, okay. So we have the carbon neutral sort of column here and net zero best practice here. Now, when we look at the definition of net zero, this is reflecting just what we saw on the last slide, right? So measuring and reducing your scopes 1 and 2 is required. Similarly, with your scope 3, you're also required to measure and you're required to reduce your scope 3. Now, what's interesting with carbon neutrality, yes, measuring scopes 1 and 2 and reducing your, scopes 1 and 2 is required, but scope 3, not required. Look at this. Scope 3, not required to make any real reduction. And that's a little bit problematic when I mentioned earlier about how scope 3 can really be the largest portion of your impact, right? The other thing that's really interesting about being carbon neutral is when we get to this sort of offsetting section here. Now, what we discussed on the last slide with net zero is that you have to make reduction, you have to make drastic reduction, and it's only those residual emissions, sort of a maximum of 10% of your scope 3 that you can apply, to carbon offsetting. Whereas with carbon neutral, you don't actually have to make any genuine reduction. You can simply offset your total carbon footprint and claim that you're carbon neutral, right? So this is a tricky one, right? And what I like about this is that, I feel like I've heard carbon neutrality talked about for ages. And while it is definitely a good thing, we work with businesses that are carbon neutral and we are so proud of them. And it is a really good step on the journey. But what we like to emphasize is that it's not the end goal, right? We need to keep pushing further and be more ambitious, right? So that's the sort of carbon neutral net zero balance, which I find quite interesting. But let me now, again, let's talk a little bit about these offsets in slightly more detail, because there is a little bit of nuance to this that I think will be helpful for everybody to understand, right? So for anyone who may be unfamiliar with the term offsetting, this refers to the practice of essentially paying for emission cuts or carbon removal, often by implication in developing countries rather than cutting your emissions in the first place, right? So carbon offset schemes allow companies to invest in international environmental projects that balance out their emissions. And as you may or may not be aware, I know I wasn't aware until relatively recently, there are actually 2 types of carbon offsets, right? So we have avoidance and removal. Now, avoidance is things that, avoid emissions going into the atmosphere eventually. So this would be things like investing in a wind farm or investing in solar panel projects, things like that, that of course will eventually mean that there are less emissions going into the atmosphere, but they're not actively sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is what we desperately need. So that's where we get to the removal offsets. That's what removal carbon offsets do. They pull carbon from the atmosphere. It's also called sequestration, carbon sequestration. And this is through projects that we may be familiar with. A lot of people have heard of, the tree planting as a carbon offset, or peatland restoration, or seagrass restoration. All of those projects are going to be pulling carbon from the atmosphere, which is what would be required when you're pursuing offsets within the net zero definition. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of projects out there that claim to be working in the carbon offsetting space. So it's extra important that you're pursuing gold standard verified carbon standards, right? So it's a specific standard to keep an eye out for. They have their whole own website with a list of detailed projects that they support, so you can look that up for more information if you need it. Now, I think it's very clear that offsetting definitely has a place within our net zero future. We do need to be quite careful, right? Because studies show that reliance on them may present risks to effective mitigation. And I know that, while nature-based offsetting is becoming increasingly popular, there are limits on the natural resources that we have available, right? I think there was a recent Greenpeace report that found that just 2 companies, I think it was NE and International Airlines Group, so just 2 companies could exhaust up to 12% of the available carbon dioxide offsettings through new forests alone, just 2. So put very simply, carbon offsetting cannot be a substitute for significant emission cuts, right? And that's why it's so important when pursuing net zero that we reserve them only for the residual scope 3 emissions, right? Okay, so I know I've thrown a lot at you. To summarize, we also have this slide with some of the key terms that are just sort of defined there, and that's just something you can have to circle back to make sure you have some of these definitions listed. Now, one of the things I like to do is kind of like try and put this into practice a little bit. I know that I can't necessarily interact with you guys, can't necessarily respond to me in real time, but just stay with me here. Let's do a little bit of a myth busting exercise. I'm just going to pause at moments where you don't have to worry about responding in the chat or anything, but just think about why these things, knowing what we know now, why these things might be myths. All of them on the slide are myths, right? So here we go, myth 1, 2, and 3. So myth 1, being carbon neutral is the end goal, right? So why would that be a myth? This is perfect. I'm gonna let you think about it while I take a sip of tea. And then I'll give you the answer. Fabulous. Okay, so being carbon neutral, we just got done talking about the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. And while carbon neutral is definitely something that is good and worth doing, the key in this myth is that it's not the end goal, right? We need to be pushing towards net zero, right? Because it's definitely much more ambitious. Then we have myth 2 here, right? Myth 2, carbon offsetting should be the first step of my emissions reduction plan. What do we think? Definitely a myth, right? Okay, and the reason this one is a myth is because carbon offsetting, while of course it has a role to play, it's not going to be the first thing that you pursue when you're looking at addressing your emissions, right? It's going to be, if anything, the last thing. You want to work towards making significant emissions reduction before pursuing carbon offsetting. Cool, that was myth 2. Now, myth 3. Scope 3 is often the smallest proportion of a carbon footprint. Right. So the key in this myth is that scope 3 is actually often the largest portion of a carbon footprint, right? So it's really important that we're making sure to include that as well. Okay, good job, everybody. I know I can't necessarily see you responding, but I trust that you were all participating in your own time and way. Fabulous. Okay, so on to the next thing, which is going to be to share with you, what I think sort of sits really nicely after giving you all this jargon, which is just examples of businesses who are doing a really good job in this space, right? So here we go. We've got some sustainability leadership to highlight. And I think these are just businesses that we've found have really inspiring sustainability stories. So there's a few examples from Wales here. We have Hewitt Denim Co. The story behind this company is that Cardigan was a small town of about 4,000 people, and 400 of them used to make jeans. You know, they made like 35,000 pairs of jeans a week for 3 decades. But then one day, the factory just closed, it left town, but all of that sort of skill and know-how remained in the community. So the Hewitt Denim Company actually set out to address unemployment and bring manufacturing back to Cardigan. And the company now prides itself on doing things, you know, really super well. They have a great emphasis on quality, durability, and sustainability. So that's a really brilliant sustainability story. For me, it really speaks to that sort of social aspect as well, which is brilliant. Then we have B1. B1 are actually Planet Mark members that are based in Wales, which is wonderful. And their focus is to increase awareness and educate everyone about the importance of bees and other pollinators in our natural ecosystems. They engage with all sectors to produce environmentally sustainable solutions to help combat our current climate emergency and in turn reverse the declining bee population, right? So these are just 2 fabulous examples for, you know, again, that environmental and that social side. Now, a real heavy hitter in the world of net zero is this last example here, Childbase. So the Childbase Partnership have been working in partnership with Planet Mark and pursuing our 0 by 30 scheme to develop a 10-year strategy to create and implement a roadmap of zero carbon solutions. Now, I could talk about Childbase quite a lot. I think they're fantastic, but actually we have a video to share with you as well. So I'm hoping this works. Give me a shout in the chat if for any reason you can't hear this, but I did all the things right. I shared with sound and it should work. So here we go. This is just a little bit from Childbase directly about their net zero journey.
I've got 2 young children. I've got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. I want them to have the same opportunities in the world that I have and I had when I was their age. These children are going through the business and then they're going to be potentially dealing with the consequences of essentially our actions and that of our forebears. So being employee owned, all of our nurseries have a say directly in the operations of the business. So all of the things I've done from a sustainability perspective for the business have gone through that body. So it's very much, you know, an engagement activity as well as a diligence. So it definitely helps us keep it in track with what the core business ethics are. We had set the target back in 2016 to do a carbon footprint, which we then did with the Planet Mark in 2018. Initially it was going to be a 5% year-on-year reduction is what we aimed for. So with the intention to be to get all of our location-based carbon down to 0 by 2045. It quickly became apparent during 2018 that we needed to speed that up as a, not just Childbase, but as a society. And then again with the Planet Mark, we jumped on the 0 by 30 initiative and then set a target to bring that to not just a location base, but the whole kit and caboodle, all 3 scopes, all included, to bring that to 2030. So we brought our own target forward by 15 years and increased scope. So we do want to be a leader in this. Generally speaking, I think what is measured is ultimately managed. The nurseries are all highly competitive, so if you create a league table, we have one for waste, for example, at the minute, and people don't want to be at the bottom of that list. We'll be doing the same for electricity and the same for gas usage, so that we can sort of drive those emissions down continually over the next few years. It's very important to involve the children in what we're doing. It's essentially what we do, so you can't run it separately to the children because they're the main stakeholder group effectively. So we have a program that we operate with Eco Schools, so they operate it as the UK version via Keep Britain Tidy. As of today, all sites, all 44 of the nurseries are green flag holders, so we're the largest provider of Eco Schools education in the country within nurseries. My top tip for net zero is just jump into it and do it. It's not something you have to wait until you've got perfect data, until you've got everything in hand, and then go, right, now we're going to go do net zero. It's almost like, actually, we haven't got time for you to wait to do it. You need to start doing it now.
Oh, lovely. I'm glad I got to share that with you and that all of our audio was working. It's so nice to hear it sort of directly from the source, right? Lovely. Now, where I'm going to go from here is just have a little conversation about reduction targets. But before I do that, I did just want to mention, I see some of you have used the chat. I don't know if any of you guys have used the Q&A yet. So don't be shy. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you at the moment. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in there. We will have time towards the end of the section, the end of the session to have a bit of a Q&A, right? I think we have at least 15 minutes set aside to kind of go through this with you and answer anything that might be outstanding, right? So feel free to capture those there. Okay, now that I've said that, let's dive into reduction targets. I wanted to just emphasize that these are particularly helpful for businesses, right? We do like to put a lot of emphasis on, having a reduction target in place because it, essentially it provides businesses something to aim for, right? Companies that set out ambitious reduction efforts that are supported by credible targets today will also gain a competitive advantage in the years to come for a few reasons, right? So one, credible targets bolster a company's reputation, right? Plain and simply, it sends a good signal, right, to your customers, your investors, stakeholders, saying that you're committed. This can also be, remember, you can also support your reduction targets by providing transparency on sort of interim targets along the way, right? So you might have net zero by 2040, but you can have all these different targets. What do you want to do by 2025? What are you going to do by 2030? Those are what we refer to as interim targets, right? Now, the other thing, and the other reason to pay attention to reduction targets and why they're so important is because, reduction targets spur, innovation, and they drive, positive change, right? So for us, it's about that ambitious goal that sort of helps focus people's minds, right? It sets that clear direction of travel for your company, right? And that really does set you up for success. So what might some of these targets look like? Well, we have a little graph here, which actually is nice because it links in well with that child-based video. And so let me just describe to you what we're seeing. So the pink line is if, we started today and we went straight to net zero, what that would look like by 2050, right? But what we're seeing is it's not often as sort of straight a path. And what we've used here to sort of reflect how businesses might actually attain net zero by 2050 is a look into an insight from our membership base and the businesses that we work with at PlanetMark. So while we do sort of recommend a minimum of a 5% annual reduction, that's that blue line there, what we're actually seeing is, through our process, businesses are actually making closer to a 12% reduction year on year, which, looking at that trajectory, puts us in a much, much, much better position, right? So pursuing something around the 12% space is definitely good. But you can definitely bring that forward, right? And lots of businesses do, like Child-Based, their net zero goal is 2030. So let's also just break down, if you wanted to put a net zero target into the public domain, what would need to be included? So we've sort of broken this down into the key elements of a net zero reduction target, right? So first one is that target time frame, right? So as we've mentioned, the absolute minimum is 2050. It should never be later than that. And if you want to be more ambitious, it's going to be about pulling that time frame forward, right? So a lot of businesses are pursuing this by 2040, and even more are also pursuing it by 2030. So that target time frame is going to be the main one. The next one is about the emission scopes. As mentioned, you need to include all of the scopes in your net zero target, right? Because of the definition of net zero, it's kind of intrinsically linked, but that's really important to keep front of mind. Then last but not least is, the emission reduction versus the base year. You do want to be very clear and specific on, sort of what is this time frame you're working on? I think liked that Child-Based video because they talked about the fact that they first did their carbon footprinting in 2016, right? So that's the baseline that they're using and that they're measuring against. Now, all of these sort of elements, however, sort of feed into what lies below, right? Which is equally, if not more so important, right? And this is about translating your net zero carbon reduction targets into clear time-bound actions, being transparent about your plans and your progress, so measuring your progress about this. And yeah, it's just all to say that, you know, reduction targets are not the end all and be all. They're definitely a step on the journey similarly to the way we talked about sort of carbon neutrality as well. So keep in mind, of course, that leading companies will go further, you know, faster as far as percentage reductions are concerned. And we will actually circulate a tool that will help you guys to sort of understand, you know, how and what kind of targets you might want to be pursuing, right? So, okay, but let's leave reduction targets for the time being. I did now want to sort of shift to talking about some really practical things, right? That's what's always most important in these sessions. We've sort of done a good job so far setting that foundational understanding, and now we're going to move to the practical side, right? The stuff that you can take away that will, you know, ensure that you are able to get on this net zero journey. So to structure this part of the session, we are going to lean on our 3-step process again, right? So measure, engage, and communicate. And to help bring this to life as well, we've also created a fictional company that we're going to use as an example throughout. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Carbon Toys. Dun, 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 Carbon Toys. Fab. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Okay, so Carbon Toys, they are a toy shop, shocker, selling carbon-based toys. They have an international supply chain. They regularly travel to trade shows and, you know, supplier evaluations, things like that. They, as far as the physical space is concerned, it's an old leaky building, right? They've got an oil burner heating system. They've got a really sort of old-fashioned back office that's very paper heavy. And they also have lots of packaging waste, right, with limited recycling facilities. Also, in addition to this, they have a small fleet of vehicles. So, and their owner here, as you can see in the picture, is Zoe. Now, Zoe actually has an 8-year-old who's been learning a lot about climate change in school and who has started putting pressure on her mom about what she's doing to help mitigate the effects of climate change. I wonder if that sounds familiar for any of you. So Zoe has taken this to heart, and she's decided to look at the operation of her business to see where improvements could be made. But because she is completely new to this, she doesn't yet know what changes to prioritize, right? What would be the most impactful and make the most difference? So to gain clarity on this, she is going to start with step 1, measuring, right? Now, a good tool to use for Zoe and for other businesses, like say yourselves, you can use this measurement guide, right? And this will be circulated following the session as well. So this is a pretty straightforward template that sort of outlines the various kinds of emission categories that exist, right? So things like fuel, electricity, fleet, business travel, water, freight, purchased goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the purpose of this exercise is simply just for you to look at the various categories and say, yes, these would apply to my business, or no, they do not, right? So for example, electricity, every business says yes to electricity, right? I don't know a single business that doesn't use electricity. However, not all businesses are engaging with business travel, for example. So there is a little bit of nuance to this, and it is a good exercise for you to do individually for your business, right? Because just by starting with this, and I know it might sound a bit high level, but just by starting with this, you can then move forward in a meaningful way. And, you know, what then comes next, essentially, I mean, we definitely don't want you to stop here. There is definitely more detailed work that we would encourage as a next step, right? So once you know what these categories are, the next step is going to be capturing data, right? So this is a nice little list of the things that we sort of recommend and how you would start going about collecting meaningful data. So the very first thing that we always suggest is to be very clear about the reporting boundary. Now, just to clarify what a reporting boundary is, you know, the more I sort of do these sessions and the more businesses I engage with, the more I realize just how complex businesses can be, right? They have head offices, they have manufacturing sites, they've got storage facilities, they've got storefronts. So what of all of those spaces is going to be included in what you're measuring, right? So that's what is within you. That's how you clarify what the reporting boundary is. Now, most of the time, businesses start with a head office overview, and then they expand the boundary over time, right? As they get comfortable with the data collection process, they build that out. So at the very least, start with the head office, but you can do more. And again, similar to the way we talk about, make sure you do all of your scopes 1, 2, and 3. We said the same about your reporting boundaries. Of course, the end goal needs to be including your entire operation, but just be really clear in this space on what you're capturing, or else it kind of gets a little bit gray. So first thing is to determine your reporting boundary. Next, it's going to be about collecting and digging out at least 12 months worth of data to establish that credible baseline, right? And this can be tough. It's oftentimes we find when, businesses are looking for this information, they realize that they didn't really have any processes in place to capture that information. But you can get creative, like lean on your suppliers, for example, your electricity providers, your waste contractors likely will have some of this documented for you, right? And make sure you're paying attention to that 12-month sort of data piece. It's important that you have a full, robust overview from a timeline perspective. So that's the 12-month sort of data side. Then as far as like what data to be collecting, I've sort of alluded to this already, but this is going to be things that are sort of listed here, right? Information from your energy bills, the fuel for your fleet, waste recycling, water, your spends on goods and services. So spend is a really common metric to use. How much are you spending on your energy bills? How much are you spending on fuel? But where you can get more nuance to that, that's definitely better, right? So, for fuel, for example, if you can identify the specific mileage, the specific types of vehicle you're using, is it diesel, is it petrol, is it hybrid, is it electric? All of that will kind of build a full picture of exactly what your impact is. So just dive into this, right? Start seeing how much you can pull together, and definitely the more information, the better. Now, once you have all of this together, you've got this lovely, I kind of picture it as like this beautiful Excel spreadsheet with a few different tabs. Then what you would need to do is go to DEFRA's website and find their conversion factors for the greenhouse gas reporting. And these are publicly available. And then what you would do is use those figures to calculate your carbon footprint, right? Now, circling back to Carbon Toys, they did this and they ended up with something that looks like, boom, this is the Carbon Toys carbon footprint. Now, the headline figure is what you're seeing in the center there, right? 157.6 TCO2e, and that stands for tons of CO2 equivalent. That's that sort of like common metric that businesses will use to establish their carbon footprint. Now, Zoe very cleverly has some great Excel skills, and she was able to create this pie chart for us, which is fab, kind of breaking down what categories there are and what percentage, what that specific balance is within that total. Now, let's also not forget that she's, not just talking about these headline figures, she's also giving us that full picture by providing the information on the left. Things like the reporting year, right? That full 12-month data set, which is awesome. The reporting boundary, we can be really clear on what from her complex, operation is included. In this example, it's the London store, her head office, her workshop, and her warehouse in the UK, right? So all of this together builds that fabulous picture of what a carbon footprint would look like for a business. And now using this, Zoe understands where her impacts are. She'll be able to use this to help identify inefficiencies and prioritize action moving forward. For example, you can see here that 43% of her total carbon footprint is from building. That means the electricity and the natural gas. So if she addresses changes to her electricity and natural gas, she'll have a very big impact. Whereas, yes, of course, she probably should still be doing some work on her water consumption, but it's a much smaller proportion. It's going to have a lower impact. So that's why this is so important, right? Helping you to be able to identify inefficiencies and prioritize action moving forward. Now, speaking of moving forward, this is definitely a continuous journey, right? So what would be next after you've been able to do this carbon footprint and provide yourself that baseline? Now, we have this sort of 6 process as a useful framework to structure action moving forward. So number 1, your carbon footprint, your baseline emissions, cool, that's been sorted. Next, it's going to be about improving operational efficiencies. It's all the solutions, right? Improve operational efficiency, transition to green energy or low carbon fuels. 4 is about embedded energy generation and storage. 5 is supply chain emissions. And then 6, last, is about, offsetting your unavoidable emissions. Now, I do know that, obviously business whales have loads of incredible advisors and experts that would be able to help you identify solutions across all of these categories. But we also, just for the sake of today and to fill some time to fill our brains, we have a nice long list of potential solutions that you can consider that we'll whiz through now as well, right? So these would be things like, from the building side, the electricity and natural gas, improving lighting, right? LED, improving insulation, using draft excluders or double glazing, all of that is in this space. Switching to renewable energy supplier, investing in on-site renewable energy. Consider a building management system, a BMS as they're referred to allow for zones to be managed separately. Invest in energy efficient equipment when it's time to upgrade, encourage your staff to get involved and provide incentives. We'll cover that in more detail, but that would be things like turning off computers, printers, lights, etc., etc. Also, conducting an energy audit to identify energy saving opportunities, right? A really good example of an energy audit that's quite cool and fun to do is a night audit. So walk around your site at 2 in the morning, assuming it's safe and all those things. But are there lights that are being left on? Is there equipment that's on? What are you seeing? What isn't used at 2 a.m. when actually you probably don't need any of that stuff to be on, right? So a night audit is a particularly good one. Also, things like just take energy efficiency into account during capital investments and new builds as well, especially when it comes to replacing gas with electric, those types of things. So that's the sort of electricity and gas side of things. Then from a transport side, right, this will be looking at creating a travel hierarchy for your organization to help create a culture of sustainable travel. When it's time to upgrade your fleet, upgrading to hybrid and electric, using local suppliers to reduce miles, encouraging your colleagues and employees to take public transport or cycle to work, for example. Use video conferencing. We've all gotten so good at that, right? Can that just not be the norm moving forward instead of flying across the world for a business meeting, right? I accept that sometimes that's required, but we've got this great opportunity now as we transition out of the pandemic to kind of maintain video conferencing as a bit of a new normal, right? Other things, consider working from home, another great example of a new normal that would have positive environmental benefits. Then things like running efficient driver training and keeping your vehicles well serviced definitely shouldn't go underestimated when it comes to maintaining the sustainability of vehicles and just your fleet or your driving in general. And then also speak to your courier companies, right? And find out if they have electric vehicles as part of their fleet as well. Okay, that's the transport side of things. Then we get to waste, right? And waste is all about that waste hierarchy, right? This is about rethinking, refusing, reducing, reusing, and then recycling, right? Oftentimes we jump straight to the recycle side of things, but we want to make sure that we're really building the full picture. We're thinking about this in the right way. So first thing would be to design out waste, right? So, bring less stuff into the business, right? In the first place. Where possible, can you switch to items that are made of recycled material? Then when we do realize that we have some waste, it's about identifying the different streams and measuring what you recycle. Your waste also consider that it might not be about just disposing it. Your waste might become somebody else's resource. A great example of this is a lot of cafes, for example, are saving their, used coffee grounds and providing them to either local gardening sort of communities, or there are actually some businesses that buy back coffee waste and turn them into like fire logs. Have you seen those coffee logs? Apparently, coffee has quite a high content of oil, right? So it's in its own way, it's kind of like its own fuel. So that's super cool. Anyway, getting thinking about what you might just normally dispose of, how can somebody else use that resource? Other things in this space, can you make use of a cardboard shredder? Speak to suppliers about taking crates back. I think suppliers in general, when it comes to looking at waste, packaging waste, things like that, are a fantastic resource. More and more of them are open to exploring these conversations, right? So pick that conversation up with them. Where possible, cutting out all single-use plastic, and get some fabulous bins and get your staff involved, right? They'll definitely be key when it comes to proper waste segregation. Next up is water. Ensure that all your water-saving fixtures are attached to your taps, your showers, your toilets. Install sensors and timers, all of these things, making sure you have a process in place checking for leaks and drips on a regular basis. Find out just find out more, right? Dive into that water bill. Hopefully you might have a smart meter or a water meter that be a suitable project to pursue in the medium or long term. Then when installing new equipment and appliances, make sure they're water efficient. Find out about the embodied water footprint for products. I think especially if you work in food in any way, food has a lot of embodied water. A very common one is like almonds, for example. I know we've all heard about the droughts in California that are caused by the almond farms. Not just that, there's lots of reasons. But anyway, that's a big one, especially if you're in the food space. The embodied water footprint of products is something definitely to look into. Then make tap water easily accessible for staff and customers, right? That refill space. Speaking of water, oh my gosh, breathe and take a sip. Oh, nothing better than tap water, right? Okay, so refilling bottles is another great one in this space. All right, next up is going to be about procurement. First and foremost, make sure you have an ethical and sustainable procurement policy in place, right? That will help you establish what your expectations are when working with, suppliers and on and on. So find out, also speaking of suppliers, find out as much as you can. Open this conversation up, right? Ask them questions. Make sure you're using suppliers who are open about their ethics, their supply chain, their carbon reduction. There are definitely businesses who, suppliers that you might be working with who are also trying to pursue net zero, right? Can you align with them? Can you work together to achieve that? I've already mentioned sort of using local suppliers to reduce your miles, but again, also looking for alternatives, to maybe the things that you're sourcing already, things that are recycled, made of natural materials, or are recyclable, right? Further down the line. Also things we've mentioned, switching to a renewable energy provider, and ultimately just, making it easier for your customers to make those green choices, right? Do you have green products for them to buy, right? Then also develop project costings and timelines for available decarbonization technologies. That's definitely a big one of those long-term projects to pursue, but definitely something to consider in this space nonetheless. Okay, wow, we did it, guys. That's the measurement side of things, followed up with loads of suggested solutions, which I know you'll be able to take to the Business Wales advisors moving forward as well. So now let's move on to step 2, which is engage, right? I'm just going to jump right in here. So what we mean by engage is essentially to include every person that you possibly can in on the sustainability journey, right? So most fundamentally, this is going to be your teams, right? Your employees, your colleagues, your managers, C-suite apprentices, interns, all of them. But we do also encourage you to expand this definition, right, to your customers and your suppliers and on and on and on. So why is this so important? You can tell I'm passionate about it. Oh, I'm an engagement manager. Ooh. So let me just break down some of the reasons why we feel this is so important. So number one, sustainability has this incredible power to unlock the talent and passion among employees, right? As employees find new meaning in the work that they do, this also translates to a boost of morale, right? Happier staff then means a more productive staff, right? Which is always a good thing. In many cases as well, these staff, the ones that find that new sort of something that they want to add into their daily responsibilities, these employees then can be your best sustainability ambassadors or representatives, the ones that can help catalyze action, raise interest and awareness, both in and outside of the organization, right? So think about, I think I always like to emphasize that the staff that are customer facing in particular, right? If they have a passion for this, this is going to spill over naturally into the work they do direct with customers. Now, an engagement strategy is also a great way to foster ownership and buy-in across the organization as changes get implemented, right? And in so many cases, your staff are going to be the experts, right? They are the ones with their fingers and on the pulse across your operation, right? They're the eyes and the ears on the ground. So therefore, surely they are going to know what areas are currently being wasteful, right? Where savings on energy, water, waste could be made. So let them get involved and help identify these sustainability solutions when the time comes. Also, when bringing, your teams together through sustainability, it fosters a really unique opportunity for collaboration, which in turn, and in combination with everything I've listed previously, this is what encourages and promotes innovation. I always like to speak to that sort of that collaborative side, especially as someone who in a past role was like a sustainability champion who was kind of roped in by the sustainability manager as, somebody to kind of lead on this. Because for me, before I had that opportunity to be a sustainability champion, I was very siloed. I was working in the reservations team. I was just at my laptop all day. And although I did like that, it wasn't very stimulating across new topics, right? I never had any reason to talk to the marketing team or the finance team or, sales, anything like that. I was just in my little reservations box. Now, when I got that role, I then had an opportunity to kind of go to all of those departments, talk to all those individuals, and not only people on my level, but people who were more senior than me, right? It was a great, great, great opportunity. So I always like to speak to that as somebody who, has been roped into this. It's really, really very, very valuable. Also, just from that sort of professional development side. So that's just an example. I think indeed the point we like to make is that we all have power and potential to create change. And it's this engagement step that is absolutely crucial in order to sort of galvanize the vast transformational action that will be required to achieve net zero. So now a little bit about sort of how to approach engagement. That's about why it's so important. And this is a little bit about how. So change management is about transitioning people to new ways of working and thinking. And while there are a lot of ways to get people to change behavior, behavior science actually suggests that some ways are more effective than others. So the classic example here is the carrot or the stick, right? It's that old idiom about how to get a donkey to move. It was said that you could either dangle a carrot in front of him or hit him with a stick from behind. But the result is essentially the same, right? The donkey's going to move forward. But do the carrot and the stick really get the same result? And the answer is no, right? Sticks don't actually work very well, right? They are short-lived and they don't drive us from a good place, right? Actions are taken out of fear and avoidance of pain. The carrot, however, generates anticipation, excitement, possibility, and they generate longer, more sustainable results. So this is very common, I find, in the world of climate change. Do we fear monger or do we talk about the opportunities? It's a fine line that every person and organization approach differently. Now, it might be it might make you think differently now if we were to go back and do that intro where I talked about the big picture at the beginning of the session. How did we tell that story, right? What is the balance that I chose to strike for you? So the carrot approach, just to kind of round us off here, the carrot approach means being empathetic and people-centered, right? It's about fostering involvement and encouraging understanding. It's about starting conversations and dialogue across your organization, right? Openness, transparency, and vulnerability are really important here, right? So let's dive into some sort of further practical stuff, some real life examples of engagement initiatives. So these would be things like setting up a green team or identifying a sustainability champion, as I kind of mentioned, or doing things like, having knowledge sharing sessions, right? Have a sustainability workshop or, a sustainability briefing or an event that all of your colleagues and employees are allowed to attend to help build that sort of common knowledge, right? I heard something recently that I think it was Brene Brown who said, without common knowledge, there can be no common understanding. So it's about establishing that and allowing everybody to come from the same place. Also, things like solution brainstorms, right? When you've identified a problem, what you want to address, allow everybody to get involved with putting solutions on the table, right? Another great thing to consider is volunteering days. It's a really lovely way to bring together the social and environmental side of this space. And it's great to be hands-on, right? Any way you can be hands-on with your team is going to be fab. Another one is internal competitions. I know Mark actually from Child-Based spoke to this. He was talking about, the ability to kind of pin the different sites against each other and kind of nobody wanting to be at the bottom of the list. So that's a really fun tool to use. Also, having somebody that's just sort of a bit of a go-to, right? We know that sustainability, net zero, it's complex, it's confusing. Having one person in your team that can just be a little bit of like the myth buster for the team can be really helpful, right? Again, it helps kind of embed that idea that we don't have all the answers right now. There's going to be things that we need help with, and this is going to be our person to go to help us navigate that, right? And then also just lead by example. Start the sustainability conversation with your suppliers and your partners, even if they haven't started this journey yet. Just by you asking the question helps them. It helps plant the seed, and it helps them sort of come along on this journey, right? Okay, so that's very good. I could talk about engagement for a long time, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of transition us over to the third and final step, which is about communicating, right? Okay, so this is about communicating the sustainability journey with confidence and authenticity, right? And this is important also for a number of reasons, right? One of which is that sharing one's sustainability journey is hugely powerful when it comes to building customer trust, right? It will help you grow your business, differentiate, attract new new clients, but it also plays a key role in your strategy's success, both internal and external audiences, right? How you were talking about the work that you were doing is hugely important. So sharing your sustainability story not only brings these sort of business benefits, but it's also important in order to drive sustainability change on a wider scale, right? We feel very strongly that it's not enough to be developing change in sort of small pockets of isolation. We need to be sharing our successes, experiences, challenges transparently, because by doing so, we empower others to do the same, right? It generates that positive feedback loop of people joining us on this journey. So things that we suggest businesses do as they sort of explore this is a variety of things here on the slide. So things like identifying a particular sustainability challenge that your company is well placed to solve, right? What is your niche within this broad, net zero sustainability sphere, right? Make sure you make that very, very relevant to your business, to your products and your services. Then, create a dedicated space on your website for sustainability, right? Not only how your products and services are helping to address that, but also how are you just choosing to, approach and address your impacts as a business that exists, because all businesses have impacts, right? So create a dedicated space on your website to just bring some life into that. For me personally, this is always the first place I go to. Even if I see something on social media, which I'll get to next, if I want a detailed overview, if I want real insight, I go to a company's website, right? Because I know that there's going to be more that you can fit on a website than you can in just sort of a short social media post. That being said, social media is the next point on the slide here, because it is a hugely powerful tool, right? We know that this is the way that sort of communication is going, especially for the younger generation. And as wealth sort of transitions to them, we're going to need to be speaking to them in a way that they resonate with. So social media is very, very important. Make sure that you are definitely highlighting the sustainability work that you're doing in that space as well. Also, identify opportunities. I've pretty much talked all about online at the moment, but there are loads of opportunities for offline communications as well. Like, physically, if you have a store, right? What are the posters? What's the signage? What's on your packaging, the packaging of your products? Also things like, menus. If you're a food-based business, that's a great place to start, plant the seed for some sustainability conversation. But really, that there's loads of offline ways that you could be sharing your sustainability journey as well. So just think about the online and the offline. Ultimately, it's about embedding this sustainability messaging across all communications, no matter what it is, right? Making sure you have a really clear communication strategy and that you're just putting it out there for everybody to see, so that you can kind of attract new customers, engage with existing customers, differentiate your business, and inspire others to join us along this journey, because we need everybody, right? Awesome. Okay, so that's the communication side of things. Let me actually circle back now to Carbon Toys. I'm conscious that I haven't talked about them in a while. Do we miss Carbon Toys? Following this three-step process, where we left them was with the measurement side of things, and they had just done their carbon footprint. But then now that, after they were able to identify where their various impacts were, they went ahead and made loads of changes. So let's see where they are now. All right, here we go. Carbon Toys journey to net zero. So one of the things they did, which is really, really big, is they have put a target in place to reach net zero by 2030, right? They have that goal, and now they know how they, where they want to get to, and they have a clear direction of travel, right? So net zero by 2030, and they've also joined the Race to Zero campaign, which I'll elaborate on more soon. They've also now, as far as going ahead and making change, they have switched to renewable energy tariff, and they've installed ground source heat pump for the building. No more leaky oil, sort of heater boiler that they're dealing with. That's super exciting. They've also installed insulation and other energy efficient measures. They're working towards installing solar panels and a wind turbine. That's super cool. They've obviously got a massive sort of physical space to do that. Then, in order to ensure that everybody internally is involved, they've put in place a staff sustainability engagement program, which is really exciting. They have a recycling scheme and a packaging reduction program. They have a business travel hierarchy and policy that's been created. They don't yet have all of their fleet moved to electrification, moved to electric vehicles, but they have a plan to do that over a period of time. They also have made great improvements to their back office system. It's sort of now been digitized. They've reduced paper usage as much as possible. And they're also proactively working with their suppliers to understand and improve their Scope 3 emissions, right? Because of the international supply chain that I mentioned they have, Scope 3 is a bit of a journey. So they were able to start with a few key categories that they had, control over, things like employee commuting, for example. But the full Scope 3 is still being improved, which that's okay. That does take time. Then last but not least, they've also developed a new range of sustainability toys, right? To help promote awareness and engage their customer base, the future generation. Wow, all right, so that's really, really fun to reflect on carbon toys. Good job, Zoe. That sounds like a brilliant sort of new company that you've established there. Now what I want to do is just sort of help you understand what tools are available to you if you wanted to go on a similar journey, right? So this is actually rounding off sort of our session here is just to talk about the tools and resources that will be available to you. Now, one thing to note, the number one place you're going to want to go for help in this space is Business Wales, right? They have an incredible amount of resource efficiency advisors and experts in this space that will be able to kind of help you through all of this. And these are just some examples of other tools that you can use in your conversations with them, right? They actually are aware of all of these tools as well. So first things first, we have an introductory guide around carbon footprinting, right? In line with that first step, measure being our top priority. This is where you're going to want to start. So if you want more detail on how to do this, how to collect data, this guide is going to be sort of the first place to start, right? So following that, however, once you are able to do a carbon footprint assessment and you know where your impacts lie, the next part of this journey is going to be identifying those solutions, right? And also organizing them in a meaningful way, right? Oftentimes this stuff can just get a little out of control, right? We know that there's a lot of emissions categories, there's a lot of work to do. So how do you organize this and prioritize this? So what we've provided as well is a sustainability plan template. Now, this is a really great organizational tool, right? It does exactly what I was saying. It kind of helps us filter all of our ideas and put it in one specific place that will help us keep things moving forward. So not only are you able to identify focus areas, like you want to focus on your electricity use specifically. It allows you to be very specific about interim targets, right? Again, even if you're trying to achieve net zero by 2030, what is your interim electricity use target, right? We want to reduce our electricity use by 30% by the end of the year. That's what you would put in this smart target column in this template. Then you get to elaborate on all the initiatives. How are you actually going to achieve that, right? You're going to switch to LED, you're going to change up some of your equipment, you're going to do a staff engagement plan. All of that is what you put in there. And then you can be really specific about next steps using that column. Now, the other really important part of this template that I like to highlight is that responsible category, right? So you know, we have to make sure that we recognize that we can't do it all, and we need to make sure we're bringing our team into this as well. So the responsible column is where you can put the names of your various team members who will be responsible for taking this forward, right? Things like facilities managers, you know, HR managers, finance directors, all of these individuals should be involved to some extent, and that's where you can actually put their names. Don't just put their titles like facilities manager, put Jerry Smith, you know, like he put his name in there, make sure that he knows that that is his responsibility. Then last but not least is about the deadline. Again, we do have these sort of organized by short, medium, and long term, but that's still a bit too vague, right? So the deadline will be like, we want to achieve this by September 2022, right? That's what you're going to use in that column. So hopefully this will be a helpful tool, again, just around the organizational sort of space. I would very much encourage you to use this with your whole team. When I was talking about everyone feeding into solutions, this is what I mean, right? Can you do this as a exercise as a full team, right? All right, and then what we've also provided is an example of how this was filled in by Carbon Toys. You know, we see that they've focused on building and transport specifically because that aligns with where their impact was. And they've been really, really good about how they've structured this, right? So they've got their SMART targets in place. They've got all of the various initiatives like switching to renewable energy and looking at their insulation, for example, also measuring their emissions for freight, just to kind of build that broader picture, and electrifying the fleet. And then also things like, you know, wind turbines and solar PV projects. That's in that long-term category, which I think is very reasonable. So that's just an example to sort of help bring it to life and help lift it off the page a little bit, but you'll have access to a blank template that you can use moving forward. The other one that I wanted to show you is this Pathway to Net Zero tool. Now, this one is going to be circulated as an Excel document, and the number one thing I would recommend you look at are the instructions on the first tab, because it is a little bit complex. It's super helpful. What this does is, whether you have a carbon footprint or not, it actually allows you to play around with the specific date. Do you want to be net zero by 2030? What about 2035? What about 2040, right? And what that trajectory would look like, right? So if you say you want to be, you know, if you don't have a footprint yet, but you do want to be net zero by 2030, you know, how much reduction should you make every year? And it's going to spit that out to you as a percentage, right? It's going to say something like, you need to be making reduction, you know, 30% reduction year on year, right? So it's a tool that allows you to sort of plot that trajectory. If you do have a carbon footprint, however, what's really exciting is you can plug in your specific numbers, right? Your scopes 1, 2, and your 3 emissions. If for some reason you don't yet have all of your scope 3 emissions mapped, there is actually a little section of this tool that allows you to pick out what industry you're in. And then using your scopes 1 and 2 data, we actually have, you know, metrics and averages for what your scope 3 emission is likely to be. And then you can plug that number in, right? So it's super cool. It's a super cool tool. And again, it allows you the, you know, the ability to play around with the year that you want to achieve net zero and what that reduction would look like as far as a percentage is concerned. So really fun tool, really helps build that picture of, you know, what your reduction target should be and how you're going to have to, you know, how much reduction you're going to have to make to achieve them, right? So that will be circulated as well. And the Business Wales Resource Efficiency Advisors have access to these tools as well. Now, the other things I wanted to sort of highlight at this time are a few key campaigns. One that you've heard me mention a lot is the Race to Zero campaign. That's the UN-backed campaign that we sort of were a part of through our Zero Carbon Tour at the beginning. This is about, you know, helping businesses across the net zero starting line by asking them to commit to a net zero target, set some interim targets, followed up by plans for actually achieving them, demonstrating immediate action, and then also committing to annual measurement and review, right? Reporting your progress in that space. So that's one that we would definitely recommend you look into. But also, locally, the Green Growth, excuse me, a bit of a tongue twister there. The Green Growth Pledge helps Welsh businesses take proactive steps towards improving their sustainability, demonstrating their positive impact on the people and places around them, as well as joining a growing community of forward-thinking organizations who are helping Wales transition to a low carbon future. So that's definitely one. Both of them are brilliant. We would encourage you to check both of them out in more detail following this session. Then, maybe last but not least, I have this whole massive slide of loads of organizations and tools that we would recommend you take a look at. At the moment, these are just the organization names. We can also circulate a link to, the actual tools that I'm recommending as well. So for example, Carbon Trust, they actually do have, if you're an SME, a small or medium-sized enterprise, they have a carbon footprint calculator available on their website. So that's definitely worth pursuing. If you want to take this into, your personal sphere at home with your family, for example, WWF have a personal carbon footprint calculator, which is really fun. It goes into other things like, diet, for example, which you wouldn't do on a corporate carbon footprint, for example. So that's another really good one. Whole Grain Digital, that's a new one that I've even only recently discovered myself. They have a website carbon calculator, right? So from the perspective of what is the footprint of our sort of digital lives, video conferencing, websites, things like that, Whole Grain Digital have a calculator that all you have to do is copy the URL for your website in, and it will spit out a carbon footprint for your website, which is really cool. Olio is great in the space of sort of if you have any food waste, it's a fantastic app that will help you redistribute that, making sure it doesn't go in the bin, but it actually gets used by either charity organizations or individuals in your community. We also then recommend looking at science-based targets. Not only as an organization are they incredibly robust and hold themselves to such a high standard, but they specifically have a target setting tool, which is also really, really helpful. Once you have a reduction target, WRI, the World Resources Institute, have a great guide about designing and communicating reduction targets specifically. So again, when you take that communication step, that's a really good one to look at. Then we also have Philips here, which you might recognize as a brand for light bulbs. And that's exactly what they are and do, but they have this great calculator on their website that helps talk about, that helps do the math for you on switching to LED, right? So not only will it help you, say if you're using this standard, filament bulb, if you change that to an LED, this is how much energy you'll save, but also this is how much money you'll save, right? So if you ever need to make a financial argument about the LEDs, that's a great place to go. Then ethical consumer, just a sort of a bit of a broad one, really. They have this fantastic sort of sustainable product ranking. They have loads of different products, everything from cat food to olive oil to shampoo, all these things, and they sort of mark them and they rank them according to ethical and sustainable standards. So it's a really cool way to start thinking about the sustainability and ethics of the products that you might be sourcing in your business. Then last but not least, and actually if you had to go to any one place, I would recommend the UK SME Climate Hub. Again, just a fantastic library of loads of different resources across all of these various sort of topics that we've discussed as well. So, wow, goodness me, we've done so well. I know we still have technically a half hour left, but I'm already kind of on the roundup for this session. So please feel free, remember to put your questions in as well. This is a look at a little bit of what we've set out to achieve today. We just want to bring this back here, right? It was about providing an overview of what net zero is, the drivers for net zero, and what the business imperatives for acting on net zero are. We also introduced the importance of target setting and carbon footprinting as a tool for you to measure your progress towards net zero. Then we explored and discussed the practical steps that you can take, right, to start your journey towards net zero, supported by our action plan framework, which I shared there towards the end. We also introduced the importance of a positive narrative. I hope you can see now why I talk the way that I do. I have a big smile on my face throughout these sessions. The importance of that positive narrative and approach to effectively engaging and communicating with your stakeholders. Then last but not least, we directed you to some relevant tools and freely available resources as well. So I'm gonna sort of leave you with a quote before we go into our Q&A, just to kind of put us in that feel-good space right here. So this is a quote from Albert Einstein. He says, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." So I hope today has helped you think a little bit differently, right, about your business, about net zero, and about your role in contributing to positive change moving forward. So I think that's it from me, but I know we wanted to go into a Q&A as well. So maybe I can just stop sharing my slides here. Let's see, there we go. Hello again.
Oh, Hannah, that was just an amazing. Thank you so much. We've got kind of notes in the chat for your incredibly comprehensive and enthusiastic presentation. The slides, I have to say, were amazing too. And is Zoe available to hire, or can you clone Zoe maybe to go and help companies?
I know, maybe she can come work as a resource efficiency advisor based on all her experience from her business. So helpful, right?
I think for me, and I think for most people watching, the fact there are so many practical solutions, templates, and the fact that there are people out there to help, because, you know, yes, there's a lot of work, isn't there? Okay, yeah. We've had a couple of questions coming in. First of all, I wanted to thank Lawrence, who's actually shared his new business idea. So he has a business to help and support organizations reduce the amount of energy they use in cooling. So that's great to hear. And if people would like to share, if they have any new ideas, it's also good to know. Okay, so one question we've got is coming from Kieran Gardner. Are there any plans and actions that are truly sustainable? At the moment, we only seem to be offsetting environmental damage by using other raw materials while ignoring the issues it creates. It's very reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can definitely understand, you know, reasons to be critical. I think that the more we learn, the more we realize, you know, the true cost of some of the alternatives that we are pursuing, right? So I think for me, definitely, I think anything that is in tune with nature, and for me, a truly sustainable solution would be one that looks at full circularity, right? So, you know, from that perspective of how the resource is extracted, how it's used, and then how it gets sort of reused and put back into the system, right? It's not just about sort of use and waste and dispose of. It's about how we can create that sort of circular economy. So there are loads of good examples of products that work within sort of a very circular system. Things like glass, for example, from a product perspective, glass is almost infinitely recyclable, right? Of course, there are nuances and difficulties with our recycling systems that challenge this, but that's one example for me. Wherever possible, I'm, you know, using a glass product rather than, you know, an alternative. Other sort of truly sustainable products for me would be things around renewable energy. Renewable energy is just absolutely one of the most impactful and fully sustainable things that we could be pursuing. Now, of course, there are challenges in this space. You know, the wind turbines themselves are made from materials that require that aren't maybe necessarily the most circular at this point in time. But one of the things we often kind of talk about when looking at this is that it's not about pursuing perfection at this point in time. It's about making progress, right? We will get to perfection. We will figure out how to have fully recyclable wind turbines at some point in time. We might not be there yet, but we need to, it doesn't mean we still can't be taking steps towards that, right? So it's important that we're not allowing perfection to get in the way of progress is kind of how I'll end on that.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Kieran. Okay, another question we've had in, is it possible to accurately work out scope 3 supply chain emissions based on spend?
Based on spend.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a good one. I think for me, there would be more information that would give you a more complete picture. Spend is a place to start. It tends to be where organizations, it tends to be the data that organizations have available, right? We have comprehensive invoicing systems. We know how much, you know what I mean? Our accounting systems as a data collection process are just like really much more advanced than our ability to capture other nuanced data. So what I would suggest is that, you know, spend is where to start. There are likely, as you explore this and you build your, data collection processes internally, there are more metrics that you should be including in order to get a fully robust picture of your scope 3 emissions. Yes.
Okay. We also have a question. So what add-on smart technology options are available for monitoring energy use in buildings that don't involve a big refit or expense?
Ooh, okay. So that's a good one. The first part of that was what technologies? What was the first word?
What add-on smart technology options are available for monitoring energy, yeah?
Oh, well, fantastic. First thing I would pursue would be, smart meters, things like that. things like as far as monitoring, I definitely encourage looking at smart meters. There are so many organizations now as well that even if it's just not just the smart meter that you have, they have these incredible software and systems that lie behind just the little readings that you're seeing on the smart meter. I have a smart meter at home, and it actually tells me very little. I do pay attention to it. But what you need is the granularity behind that, right? You need to understand the spikes in the day and the troughs and where that spend is coming from. So looking at pursuing some of these software solutions, and let me see if I can pull some of them out. I'm not sure if I have any off the top of my head, but there are a lot of companies working in this space essentially to provide real-time energy monitoring data, right? Where you get alerts on your phone that, oh, your energy consumption's gone up, what's happening, who's on site, who's using what equipment has gone on, so that you can monitor in real time. I think that's always what I hear, is that, having an energy report or, looking at your spend at the end of the month is only so helpful, right? Those real-time interventions are also worth pursuing. So I would definitely recommend looking at those. Yeah.
Okay. This is about the fact that a lot of people are working from home now. So how can a company or whatever account for their home working emissions? Or can you do that?
Yes, you can do that. There is a white paper that was published, I think just sometime last year, about standards for home office working, emissions. I can't remember who published the white paper off the top of my head. It's probably buried in my inbox somewhere. But that's another one that I could pull out, because there are definitely standards for this now. And what we have done at PlanetMark, for example, is although we were using sort of averages and standards in the first half of 2020, right, where we were all during the pandemic, like figuring this out, we use some sort of averages and general information. But now businesses who are transitioning to, fully work from home operations are being much more detailed about it, as you should, right? If you know that work from home is going to be a part of your, future, it then becomes about, putting a process in place to capture information more granularly, right? Instead of just saying, this is what, the average would be for 50 employees, you then start getting the exact information from each of their employees, right? How much electricity are they using? What type of energy tariff are they on, right? You can go into that kind of detail, and some organizations are pursuing that. So it's absolutely going to be a huge consideration for us in the new future that we see for ourselves. So highly recommend putting some processes in place to get more granular detail on that. But start with the white paper. It at least, will help you kind of build that full picture of how to approach it generally, which is helpful.
Thank you. So you've said offsetting of residual emissions should be a last resort, but what are the most effective offsetting options if you are using them as a last resort?
Yes, if you are using them as a last resort. So I would always refer to the gold standard projects. They have a whole website about the various things that they're doing across the world. But a lot of these are about sort of nature restoration, anything that has to do with restoring nature, right? Not just conserving it. Conservation projects are very helpful, and we definitely need those as well. But this is about improving the natural systems that we currently have, right? So things like tree planting, very, very common, but also ensure that the projects that you're, looking at or pursuing have a long-term vision, right? Putting the tree in the ground is 1% of the job. Keeping that tree alive for the next 5, 10, 20, 100 years, that's the real core of the project, right? So that's why these things have to be quite robust and holistic, working with local communities to protect, preserve, and sort of monitor and look after these spaces as well. So yes, for me, it's just anything to do with nature restoration.
Okay, so we've had an answer back from Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for a great morning. So according to the COP26 agreement, the transition to green energy isn't enough. The focus on energy efficiency needs to be increased. He'd be very pleased to hear from any big user of energy from refrigeration, like food manufacturers, food storage, or data centers. If anyone is out there who could get in touch with Lawrence, that'd be great. Also worth mentioning, many buildings have a building management system and sub-metering can run off the back back of this, you also need to look at degree days and consider real power. Anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, I think that's a great point, actually. I think I really like the point, Lawrence, that you made about, transitioning to green energy isn't enough. I think in general, what we often say as well is, you cannot put your eggs all in one basket, as the saying goes. Not only do you have to, of course, pursue renewable energy solutions, but you definitely, exactly as you've said, Lawrence, have to pursue a focus on energy efficiency. But in addition to that, you have to look at your water, you have to look at your travel, you have to look at your procurement, you have to look at all of it, right? So although there are these sort of quick wins, and oftentimes, when you're on the start of this journey, you look at your biggest impacts, which often is tied up in energy, please know that eventually you are going to have to address your impact across every single category, right, to get to net zero. So I think the wider conversation there is really good, Lawrence. And yeah, really interesting to hear about your work as well. And I like the point you made about the business management systems as well. Just when it comes to having smart metering and things like that, it isn't just one meter for your whole business. You can actually get sub metering, which is really helpful, and also within that allows you to control different parts of your site. So if you have a very large operation in particular, I definitely would suggest pursuing that as well. So really good advice, good tip.
Thank you, Lauren. So if you put your email in the chat, then if anybody would like to get in touch with you, then they can do so. Okay, so another question. With the recent and projected massive increases in energy bills, are green energy suppliers now a cheaper option?
That's a great question. So I'm not sure if they're necessarily cheaper, but what we do know is that they are right on track, right? Now, the days of renewable energy being too costly are gone. They are as price competitive, if not more so. I think there probably are some examples where they might be slightly less, but because of the demand for them going up, I think they're probably still quite in line with standard energy prices.
Okay, so nothing's coming through at the moment. I just wanted to share a really good initiative that happened here in Cardiff before COVID. So looking at food waste. So a couple of head kind of top chefs got together and they used all the food waste from a supermarket and they invited guests to a 5-course meal. So the people had to pay for the food, but they had to be really creative and inventive and use any kind of food waste rather than throwing it away. And it was such a fantastic initiative. They haven't done it again, I think maybe because of COVID. But to me, you were saying that, getting new customers, and it was such a lovely idea to go and think, this is food that otherwise would have been thrown away. It's delicious, it's local. It was a fabulous, idea. And then you're talking about the schools, the child base. I go into schools quite a lot, and I was thinking last week, actually, all of them now have their flasks for refillable water. And that just wasn't happening, was it? Pre-COVID. And I was thinking, gosh, it takes a while, doesn't it, for things to change? But just so nice to see that.
Oh, lovely examples.
Yeah, and it's just you think, we're saying you can't get perfection, but everyone can do their little steps, can't they?
Yeah,
Lawrence has put his email address in. I don't think we have any more questions. So would anything you'd like to say, Hannah? I think you've actually spoken quite a lot.
I know I've rattled off quite a bit this morning. No, I thank you all so much for being here and for inviting me. Please feel free to reach out to me and Planet Mark as well. We're just so passionate about the subject, and I'm sure there'll be more opportunities for us to engage with you moving forward. But ultimately, just take that step, right? I liked what Mark said, is like, just dive in, just start. Again, you don't have to let perfection sort of inhibit your progress. So that's all from me.
And where is Planet Mark?
So we are London-based, but actually, speaking of home working, we're a fully virtual company. So we have individuals actually all over the country to assist with our various different operations and products and things like that.
Well, thank you once again, diolch yn fawr, Hannah, for an amazing presentation. So basically, thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon. But we're going to be back later on this afternoon. But just before we go, to see what else we're offering, I'm not sure if we have this at the moment in the facility. We're back at 2 o'clock this afternoon for a session on the new business waste and recycling regulations, where we'll learn the requirements on businesses to segregate their waste streams and recycle more. Rydyn ni nôl am 2 prynhawn yma ar gyfer sesiwn ar y rheoliadau gwastraff busnes ac ailgylchu newydd, lle byddwn ni'n dysgu am y gofyniad ar fusnesau I wahanu I ffrydiau gwastraff ac ailgylchu nhw. So we're back at 2, but remember there are sessions all through the week. So check us out and hopefully see you again. Diolch yn fawr.